When Brandon Musellum walks into Sunshine Auto Sales to buy a new car, he's ignored by salesman Rick Daniels, who rushes to help a white customer instead. Everything changes when the dealership's manager, Michael Wilson, steps in and calls Rick son, causing the nervous salesman to drop his keys. What begins as a familiar story of prejudice soon reveals itself as something more complex, a careful balancing act between justice and redemption, as three men navigate the aftermath of a violent past and the possibility of change. Brandon McCellum woke up early on Saturday morning with butterflies in his stomach. Today was the day. After 2 years of saving every extra penny from his teacher's salary, he finally had enough for a down payment on a new car. His old Honda had served him well for 12 years, but lately it spent more time in the repair shop than on the road. Just last week, it had broken down again, making him 20 minutes late for his first period math class. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" asked Tanya, his wife of 8 years, as she handed him a travel mug of coffee. Brandon shook his head. "I've got this. I did all my research, know exactly what I want, and I'm not going to let any salesperson talk me into extras I don't need." Tanya smiled and straightened the collar of his blue t-shirt. "My smart, careful man. Call me when you've picked one so I can come see it." Brandon kissed her goodbye and headed out the door. The Honda started on the third try, making a worrying rattling sound that only strengthened his determination. 15 minutes later, he pulled into Sunshine Auto Sales, the largest dealership in town. The lot was filled with shiny cars of every color, their windows sparkling in the morning sun. Brandon had spent hours online looking at their inventory. They had exactly what he wanted: a mid-sized SUV with good gas mileage, plenty of cargo space for hauling classroom supplies, and excellent safety ratings. He parked his old car at the E-Type Harry, far end of the lot, a little embarrassed by how it looked next to the gleaming new vehicles. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his folder of research, printouts of car specs, financing options, and a pre-approval letter from his credit union. He was ready. The showroom doors slid open automatically, greeting him with a blast of cool air. Inside, the space was bright and open, with polished tile floors that reflected the overhead lights. New cars were displayed on slightly raised platforms, their paint jobs so perfect they looked almost wet. Near the entrance, 4 salespeople stood chatting. 3 were already helping customers: a young couple looking at a minivan, an older man examining a pickup truck, and a middle-aged woman sitting at a desk going over paperwork. The 4th salesperson, a white man with thinning brown hair who looked to be in his 50s, glanced up when Brandon entered. Brandon made eye contact and smiled, expecting the man to approach him. Instead, the salesperson quickly looked down at some papers on his desk, shuffling them around as if searching for something important. "Good morning," Brandon called out, loud enough to be heard. The salesman, Rick, according to his nameplate, nodded without looking up. "Morning. Feel free to look around." Brandon stood there for a moment, then shrugged and walked toward the SUV section. Maybe the guy was busy with something. No big deal. He spent the next 15 minutes examining the models he was interested in, occasionally glancing back to see if Rick was coming to help him. The salesman remained at his desk, alternating between his computer and his phone, though he didn't appear to be actually doing anything important. Brandon opened the door of a silver SUV and sat in the driver's seat. It felt good, spacious, but not too big, with easy-to-reach controls and excellent visibility. This could be the one. He looked around for someone to ask about a test drive, but Rick was still avoiding eye contact. Other customers came and went. A service technician passed through. The cleaning person emptied a trash can. Still, no one approached Brandon to ask if he needed help. After 30 minutes of this, Brandon was getting frustrated. He was just about to walk over to Rick's desk when the showroom doors opened again. A white woman in her 40s wearing designer jeans and carrying an expensive-looking purse walked in. Rick's head snapped up immediately. He stood, straightened his tie, and hurried over to her with a wide smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Welcome to Sunshine Auto Sales. How can I help you today?" The woman smiled back. "I'm just browsing. My lease is up next month, and I'm considering my options." "Perfect timing. We have some excellent lease specials right now. What kind of vehicle are you currently driving?" Brandon watched this exchange with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew what was happening. It wasn't the first time. In his 13 years of teaching math at Westside High School, Brandon had earned the respect of students, parents, and colleagues. He had a master's degree, owned a home, and had never missed a bill payment. Yet here he was, being ignored, while browsing for cars that he could absolutely afford. While someone who had just walked in was getting immediate attention, he felt his face grow warm with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Part of him wanted to walk out, to take his business elsewhere. But another part, the part that had faced this kind of treatment before, refused to give up so easily. Brandon took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was here. He needed a reliable car to get to school on time. His students deserved a teacher who wasn't stressed about breaking down on the highway. He had done his research and knew this dealership had the best prices in town. He would not let someone else's prejudice stop him from getting what he needed. Brandon closed the SUV door and walked toward Rick's desk, folder in hand, determined to be acknowledged. As he approached, Rick turned slightly away, continuing his animated conversation with the woman about various luxury features. "Excuse me," Brandon said firmly, standing directly in Rick's line of sight. "I've been looking at your SUVs for over half an hour now, and I'd like some assistance when you have a moment." Rick glanced at him, then back to the woman. "I'll be with you shortly, sir. I'm just helping this customer first." The woman looked at Brandon, then at Rick with a slight frown. "Actually," she said, "I think this gentleman was here before me. I'm really just looking today." Rick's smile faltered for a second. "Oh, well, I can help you both. Let me just grab some brochures for you to look at while you wait," he said to Brandon, walking away before either of them could respond. Brandon and the woman exchanged looks. "Has he been ignoring you this whole time?" she asked quietly. Brandon nodded. "Since I walked in," she shook her head in disgust. "That's not right." Just then, a door at the back of the showroom opened, and a tall, well-dressed black man stepped out. His nameplate identified him as Michael Wilson, general manager. He surveyed the showroom with a practiced eye, and his gaze landed on Brandon. But before Michael could approach, Rick returned with some brochures and handed them to Brandon. "Here you go. Take a look at these while you wait," Rick said quickly. "I'll be with you as soon as I finish helping this lady." Brandon took the brochures, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. The woman gave him an apologetic look before allowing Rick to lead her away to the sports car section. Instead of making a scene, Brandon walked over to the waiting area. Leather chairs surrounded a small table with magazines and a coffee machine. He sat down, opened his folder, and pretended to review his research notes. But inside, he was seething. This knot in his stomach was all too familiar. He had felt it the first time a store security guard followed him around at age 12. He had felt it when a woman clutched her purse tighter in an elevator. He had felt it at faculty meetings when his ideas were overlooked until a white colleague repeated them. Brandon pulled out his phone and texted Tanya. "Still waiting for someone to help me. The salesman is ignoring me." Her reply came quickly. "Are you serious? That's not right. Want me to come down there?" "No, it's okay. I'm going to stick it out. Ask for the manager, babe. Don't let them treat you like this. Brandon looked up from his phone. The manager, Michael Wilson, was now talking with another salesperson across the showroom. Maybe Tanya was right. He should just go straight to the manager. But something held him back. Years of trying to be the good one, the one who didn't make trouble, the one who always had to be twice as calm, twice as patient, twice as qualified just to be treated equally. So he waited. He watched as Rick enthusiastically showed the woman feature after feature on different cars. He watched as another couple entered and was immediately greeted by a different salesperson. He watched as people came and went, all getting better service than him. After 15 more minutes, Brandon decided he had waited long enough. He stood up, tucked his folder under his arm, and walked toward Michael Wilson's office. But before he reached it, his phone buzzed with another text from Tanya. Did they help you yet? No. About to talk to the manager. Good. Remember, you deserve respect. We can go to another dealership if needed. Brandon smiled at his wife's support. Tanya always had his back. They had met in college, both studying to be teachers. She understood the daily cuts and scrapes of living in a world that sometimes seemed designed to wear you down. Just as he put his phone away, Rick appeared at his side. Sorry for the wait, Rick said, not sounding sorry at all. What kind of vehicle were you interested in? Brandon had rehearsed what he would say in this moment. He had planned to be direct but polite, to call out the unfair treatment without losing his cool. But now, face to face with Rick, he hesitated. Getting angry wouldn't help. Making a scene would only reinforce stereotypes, and he really did need that car. I'm interested in your mid-sized SUVs, Brandon said evenly. I've been researching the models you have on your website. Rick nodded, his eyes darting around the showroom. Those are popular. But have you considered a sedan instead? Better gas mileage? Lower payments? Brandon knew what this was. The assumption that he couldn't afford what he wanted. No, he said firmly. I need an SUV. I'm a teacher and often transport supplies. I came prepared to make a purchase today. He patted his folder. Rick looked skeptical. Well, let's start with what monthly payment you're comfortable with, and we can see what fits your budget. The knot in Brandon's stomach tightened further. He was about to respond when he noticed Michael Wilson walking toward them. Good morning, Michael said, with a warm smile. I couldn't help noticing you've been waiting quite a while. Has someone been helping you? Before Brandon could answer, Rick jumped in. Yes, sir. I'm just getting started with him. Michael looked from Rick to Brandon, his expression suggesting he didn't quite believe this. And how long have you been waiting, sir? About 45 minutes now, Brandon replied. Michael's eyebrows rose. 45 minutes? That's unacceptable. He turned to Rick with a stern look, then back to Brandon. I sincerely apologize. I'm Michael Wilson, the general manager. He extended his hand. Brandon Masellam, he replied, shaking Michael's hand. Mr. Masellam, what brings you to Sunshine Auto Sales today? I'm looking for a mid-sized SUV, something reliable for my daily commute to the school where I teach. Michael's face brightened. A teacher? My sister teaches 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary. What do you teach? Math at Westside High. Fantastic. We appreciate educators in this community. Michael gestured toward the SUV display area. Please, let me show you some options myself. Brandon glanced at Rick, who stood with his mouth slightly open, clearly surprised by his manager's intervention. Rick's face had turned a shade paler. Mr. Wilson, I can handle this customer, Rick said quickly. Michael gave Rick a look that instantly silenced him. I believe Mr. McCallum has waited long enough. Why don't you help the couple that just walked in? He nodded toward the entrance where a young couple was looking around uncertainly. Rick hesitated, then nodded stiffly and walked away. Michael turned back to Brandon with an apologetic smile. "Now, tell me what you're looking for in an SUV, Mr. Masellam." As they walked toward the display area, Brandon felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Michael had a calm, confident presence that made him feel respected for the first time since he'd entered the dealership. "I need something reliable," Brandon explained. "My current car is always breaking down, and I can't be late for my classes. The kids deserve better than that." Michael nodded, understanding. "My sister says the same thing. She's always up early, preparing for her students. Teachers are the backbone of our community." They stopped in front of a row of gleaming SUVs. "These are our mid-sized models, all with excellent safety ratings and good gas mileage. Any particular features you're looking for?" Brandon pulled out his research folder. "I've been comparing these 3 models," he said, pointing to the printouts. "I'm leaning toward the Atlas. I like the extra cargo space and the warranty." Michael seemed impressed by Brandon's preparation. "You've done your homework. The Atlas is an excellent choice. It's one of our most popular models with families and professionals who need extra space." He opened the driver's door of a deep blue Atlas. "Go ahead, sit inside and get a feel for it." Brandon slid into the driver's seat. The interior was spacious and comfortable, with intuitive controls and good visibility. He could already picture himself driving to school in this, arriving early and stress-free. "What do you think?" Michael asked. "I like it," Brandon replied, running his hand over the steering wheel. "Very much," Michael smiled. "Let me tell you about some of the features that make this model stand out." For the next 20 minutes, Michael walked Brandon through the vehicle's specifications, answering his questions knowledgeably and without the high-pressure tactics Brandon had expected. They discussed pricing, financing options, and even maintenance costs. "My sister bought her SUV here 3 years ago," Michael mentioned as they examined the cargo space. "She's had 0 problems with it. Brings it in for regular maintenance, and that's it. Reliable transportation is especially important for teachers." "I know." Brandon appreciated Michael's understanding. "Definitely. When my car breaks down, it's not just me who suffers. It's my students, too." "How long have you been teaching?" Michael asked. 13 years now. All at Westside High. Math, right?" "That was my worst subject in school," Michael admitted, with a laugh. "My son was the opposite, though. Math and science came naturally to him." Brandon noticed how Michael's face lit up when he mentioned his son. "He must take after his mother, then," Brandon joked. "That's what I always told him." Michael agreed with a wide smile. "Jamal graduated from State University 2 years ago. Engineering degree. I couldn't be prouder." They continued discussing the vehicle, but Brandon felt the conversation had shifted. There was a connection now. 2 fathers sharing pride in education and achievement. After exploring all the features of the Atlas, they moved to a desk to discuss numbers. Michael was straightforward about pricing, explaining the dealership's policy and where there was room for negotiation. "I appreciate your honesty," Brandon said as he reviewed the figures. "I was worried about the whole car buying process, to be honest." Michael nodded understandingly. "Many people feel that way. The car industry doesn't always have the best reputation for transparency. That's something I've been working to change since I became manager here 5 years ago." As they talked, Brandon noticed Rick watching them from across the showroom. The salesman seemed agitated, repeatedly checking his watch and shuffling papers on his desk. Michael followed Brandon's gaze. "Don't worry about Rick. He's been with us for 5 years, has his good days and bad days." There was something in Michael's tone that made Brandon curious. It wasn't just a manager making excuses for an employee's poor customer service. There seemed to be more to the story. 5 years is a long time, Brandon commented. You must value his work. A complicated expression crossed Michael's face. Everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves, he said carefully. Sometimes people can surprise you, for better or worse. Before Brandon could respond, Michael shifted back to business mode. Now, would you like to take the Atlas for a test drive? It's important to make sure it feels right on the road. Absolutely, Brandon agreed, though his mind was still processing Michael's cryptic comment about Rick. Michael stood up and called across the showroom, "Rick, can you come here, please?" Rick looked up, his face tense. He walked over slowly, as if approaching a difficult task. "Yes, sir?" "Mr. McCallum would like to test drive the Blue Atlas. Could you please get the keys and take him out?" Rick's eyes darted between Michael and Brandon. "Of course. Right away." As Rick hurried off to get the keys, Michael turned to Brandon. "I'm afraid I have some paperwork that needs my immediate attention, or I would join you. But I've told Rick to take good care of you." He extended his hand. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. McCallum. When you return from the test drive, feel free to ask for me if you have any questions or concerns." Brandon shook Michael's hand. "Thank you for your help." Michael lowered his voice slightly. "And again, I apologize for the wait earlier. That's not how we do business here." As Michael walked back to his office, Brandon wondered about the dynamics at play in this dealership. There was clearly more going on between Michael and Rick than a typical manager-employee relationship. Rick returned with the keys, looking slightly more composed. "The Blue Atlas is right this way, Mr. McCallum, if you'll follow me." As they walked toward the exit, Brandon noticed a framed photograph on Michael's desk. It showed Michael with his arm around a young black man wearing a graduation cap and gown, both beaming with pride. That must be Jamal, Brandon thought. Like father, like son. Outside, the summer heat hit them like a wall. The Blue Atlas was parked in a designated test drive spot near the front of the lot. Rick walked slightly ahead of Brandon, keys jingling in his hand. His shoulders were tense, and he hadn't said a word since they left the showroom. Rick used the key fob to unlock the SUV. "You can drive first," he said flatly. "I'll sit in the passenger seat to answer any questions." Brandon nodded and got into the driver's seat. The leather was hot from sitting in the sun, but the interior still had that pleasant new car smell. He adjusted the seat and mirrors, taking his time to get comfortable. Rick slid into the passenger seat and immediately started fiddling with the air conditioning controls, seemingly desperate for something to do with his hands. "Take a right out of the lot," he instructed. "There's a good test route that will let you try highway speeds and some city driving." Brandon followed Rick's directions, steering the Atlas out of the dealership lot and onto the main road. The SUV handled smoothly, with responsive steering and good acceleration. "The engine is a V6, Rick said mechanically, as if reciting from a script. "Good power, but still decent fuel economy. This model has the advanced safety package with lane keeping assist and automatic emergency braking." They drove in awkward silence for a few minutes. Brandon could feel Rick's discomfort filling the space between them. Finally, as they stopped at a red light, Brandon decided to break the tension. "Mr. Wilson seems like a good boss," he said casually. Rick's hands twitched in his lap. "He's fair," he replied shortly. "He mentioned you've been here 5 years?" "That's right." Rick was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. The light turned green, and Brandon accelerated smoothly. The SUV responded well, and he found himself enjoying the drive despite the uncomfortable company. "Turn left at the next intersection," Rick instructed. "That will take us onto the highway." Brandon followed the directions, and soon they were merging onto the highway. The Atlas handled the increased speed with ease, its engine purring quietly. "Power is good," Brandon commented. "Feels stable, too." Rick nodded but didn't elaborate. His entire body language screamed that he didn't want to be there. After a few miles on the highway, Rick directed Brandon to exit and take a route through a residential area. As they drove past West Side High School, Brandon pointed it out. "That's where I teach. West Side High." Rick glanced at the school building without interest. "Take a right at the next light." Brandon tried again. "I've been teaching there for 13 years. Math department. Must be rewarding," Rick said flatly. The test drive continued with similar attempts at conversation, each one falling flat. Rick answered questions about the vehicle's features, but volunteered nothing more. After about 20 minutes, they were heading back to the dealership. As they pulled into the lot, Brandon spotted Michael standing outside the showroom door, talking with a young mechanic in coveralls. The mechanic was a young black man, tall like Michael. Even from a distance, Brandon could see the resemblance. "Is that Michael's son?" Brandon asked. Rick's head snapped up. He looked where Brandon was pointing and immediately tensed even further. "Yes," he said, so quietly Brandon barely heard him. They parked in the same spot where they'd started, and Rick reached for the door handle immediately, clearly eager to escape. "Wait," Brandon said. "I have some questions about the—" But Rick was already out of the car, leaving Brandon mid-sentence. Brandon sighed and got out as well. As he walked toward the showroom, he saw Michael and his son deep in conversation. Michael looked up, noticed Brandon, and waved him over. "Mr. McCallum, how was the test drive?" Michael called out. Brandon walked toward them, aware that Rick was hurrying in the opposite direction, back into the showroom. "It was great. The Atlas drives beautifully." "Excellent." Michael turned to the young man beside him. "Jamal, this is Mr. McCallum. He's a math teacher at West Side High. Mr. McCallum, this is my son, Jamal. He works in our service department part-time while finishing his master's degree." Jamal extended his hand with a friendly smile. "Nice to meet you, Mr. McCallum." "Likewise," Brandon replied, shaking his hand. "Your father mentioned you're studying engineering?" "Yes, sir. Mechanical engineering. 1 more year to go." "That's impressive. We need more young people in STEM fields." Jamal smiled. "My dad likes to tell everyone I got my math skills from my mom." Michael laughed. "It's true. I could barely help him with his homework past 4th grade." The easy rapport between father and son reminded Brandon of his own relationship with his teenage son, Andre. Before he could respond, Rick emerged from the showroom, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Wilson," Rick called out, his voice strained. "The Millers are here to pick up their sedan. They're asking for you." Brandon didn't miss how Rick's eyes skittered away from Jamal, or how Jamal's friendly expression hardened slightly. "I'll be right there," Michael replied. He turned back to Brandon. "So, what do you think? Is the Atlas the one for you?" "I think so," Brandon said. "I'd like to go over the numbers once more, if that's okay." "Of course, Rick can help you with that." "Rick," Michael called, "Mr. McCallum is ready to discuss financing. Take good care of him, son." At the word son, something strange happened. Rick flinched visibly, and his hand, which had been holding a set of keys, suddenly spasmed. The keys fell to the ground with a loud jangle. Rick's face flushed red as he bent to pick them up, his hands trembling slightly. Brandon noticed Jamal watching Rick with an unreadable expression. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken tension. "Yes, sir," Rick mumbled, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Right this way, Mr. Musellum. As Brandon followed Rick back into the showroom, his mind was racing. What had just happened? Why did Rick react so strongly to being called son? And what was the source of the obvious tension between Rick and Jamal? Inside, Rick led Brandon to his desk, his movements stiff and mechanical. Please have a seat, Mr. Musellum. I'll pull up the financing options for the Atlas. Brandon sat down, still processing what he had witnessed. Something was definitely off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. As Rick typed on his computer, his hands still shaking slightly, Brandon decided to test a theory. Mr. Wilson seems like he really values you as an employee, doesn't he? Brandon said casually. Rick's typing faltered. He's a good man, he said quietly. Better than most. And his son seems like a fine young man too. At the mention of Jamal, Rick's shoulders tensed even further. Yes, he said, his voice barely audible. He is. Before Brandon could probe further, Rick turned the computer screen toward him. Here are the financing options for the Atlas. With your credit score and the current promotions, you qualify for our best rate. Brandon recognized the deflection but decided not to push. He was here to buy a car, after all, not solve the mysteries of Sunshine Auto Sales. Still, as Rick walked him through the numbers, Brandon couldn't help but wonder what story lay beneath. The surface of this dealership. These monthly payments look good, Brandon said, pointing at the screen. And the interest rate is better than I expected. Rick nodded, still avoiding eye contact. Your credit score helps, and you're putting down a good amount. As they reviewed the paperwork, Brandon noticed Rick's hands were still trembling slightly. His behavior had completely changed from when Brandon first entered the dealership. Gone was the dismissive attitude, replaced with an anxious nervousness that made Rick seem almost fragile. Do you need a minute? Brandon asked when Rick dropped his pen for the second time. Rick shook his head quickly. No, I'm fine. He took a deep breath. Just a lot going on today. Just then, Jamal walked by their desk, carrying a clipboard. He glanced their way, and Rick's whole body tensed up again. Jamal continued to the parts department without saying anything, but the effect of his mere presence on Rick was striking. Brandon couldn't ignore it anymore. Did something happen between you and Jamal? He asked directly. Rick's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. What? No. Why would you ask that? Just curious. There seems to be some tension. Rick looked around nervously, then lowered his voice. It's complicated. Ancient history. Nothing that affects your car purchase. Brandon decided to back off. Fair enough. Let's get back to the paperwork. They continued going through the forms, but the awkward atmosphere remained. Every few minutes, Rick would glance toward the service department door, as if worried Jamal might reappear. After they finished reviewing all the numbers, Rick slid a form across the desk. This is just to get the process started. No obligation yet. I'll need to check with our finance manager to make sure everything is approved. Brandon read through the form carefully before signing it. Rick took it and stood up. I'll be right back. I need to speak with our finance department. As Rick walked away, Brandon pulled out his phone to text Tanya. Almost done. Found a great SUV. There's some weird drama at this dealership, though. Tanya replied immediately. Oh? What kind of drama? Not sure. Something between the salesman and the owner's son. Very tense. Maybe the son dated the salesman's daughter or something? Brandon smiled at his wife's theory. Maybe. I'll tell you all about it when I get home. As he put his phone away, Brandon noticed Michael coming out of his office. The manager spotted him and walked over. Everything going smoothly, Mr. Musellum? Michael asked. Yes, thank you. Rick's just checking with the finance department. Michael nodded. Good. I wanted to make sure you were being taken care of properly." There was something in his tone that made Brandon curious. "Rick seems nervous." Michael sighed. "Rick has his challenges. We all do." He paused, seeming to consider whether to say more. "Teaching high school, I'm sure you've seen how people can change, for better or worse." "Every day," Brandon agreed. "Some of my most difficult students have turned into remarkable adults. And some haven't," Michael added quietly. Before Brandon could respond, Rick returned with a folder. "Everything's been approved, Mr. Musellum. We can proceed whenever you're ready." Michael put a hand on Rick's shoulder. "Good job, son." There it was again. Rick flinched at the word son, though he controlled it better this time. Just a slight tightening around his eyes, a small twitch of his shoulder under Michael's hand. "Thank you, sir," Rick said stiffly. Michael nodded too, both of them, and walked back to his office. Brandon watched him go, then turned his attention back to Rick, who was arranging papers with unusual intensity. "So, what happens next?" Brandon asked. "We'll need to complete these financing forms," Rick explained, his professional mask back in place. "Then we can schedule a delivery date. The Blue Atlas is in stock, so you could take it home as early as tomorrow." As they worked through the forms, Brandon heard raised voices from the service department. He couldn't make out the words, but one of the voices sounded like Jamal's. Rick heard it too. His pen stopped moving and his body went rigid. A crash followed, like something metal hitting the floor, and Rick actually jumped in his seat. A few seconds later, a mechanic burst through the service department door. "Rick!" the mechanic called out. "Can you come here? We need your help with something." Rick looked torn, his eyes darting between the mechanic and the paperwork on his desk. "Go ahead," Brandon said. "I can wait." With visible reluctance, Rick stood and followed the mechanic through the door. As soon as he was gone, Brandon's curiosity got the better of him. He stood up and wandered over to a bulletin board near the water cooler. It was covered with employee notices, community events, and newspaper clippings about the dealership. One yellowed clipping caught his eye. The headline read, "Local business owner gives second chance." The photo showed a younger Michael Wilson standing outside the dealership. Brandon leaned closer to read the article, but before he could make out the text, Rick returned. "Sorry about that," Rick said, slightly out of breath. "Where were we?" Brandon returned to the desk, glancing once more at the bulletin board with the newspaper clipping. "We were working on the financing forms," he said, sitting down. Rick nodded and shuffled through the papers, but Brandon noticed his hands were shaking worse than before. There was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, and his breathing was uneven. "Is everything okay back there?" Brandon asked, nodding toward the service department. "Fine," Rick said quickly. "Just a small issue with a customer's car. Nothing serious." Brandon didn't believe him. The tension in Rick's body told a different story. But he didn't push it. Instead, he focused on the paperwork in front of him. They still had several forms to complete, and Brandon read each one carefully before signing. "You're very thorough," Rick commented, as Brandon carefully reviewed a warranty document. "I like to know what I'm getting into," Brandon replied. "I tell my students to always read the fine print." Rick almost smiled. Good advice. The paperwork seemed endless. Financing agreements, warranty options, insurance forms. Brandon's hand was getting tired from signing his name so many times. As Rick prepared another form, Brandon decided to try one more time to understand what was happening. "I couldn't help noticing the newspaper article on your bulletin board," he said casually. "Something about Mr. Wilson giving a second chance?" Rick froze, his pen hovering over the form. For a moment, Brandon thought he wouldn't respond. Then, without looking up, Rick said quietly, "Mr. Wilson believes in second chances. Not everyone does." Before Brandon could follow up, Michael appeared at their desk. "How's it going here?" he asked cheerfully. "Almost done with the mountain of paperwork?" "Getting there," Brandon replied. "Just a few more forms, I think." Michael nodded, approvingly. "Rick is very thorough with his paperwork. Makes our finance department happy." He patted Rick's shoulder. "One of our most meticulous employees, aren't you, son?" There it was again. Rick tensed at the word son. This time, Brandon was watching carefully. Rick's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight flinch, a tightening of his jaw, a quick downward glance. "Just doing my job, Mr. Wilson," Rick mumbled. Michael smiled. "And doing it well." He turned to Brandon. "I hope Rick has been taking good care of you." "Yes, he has," Brandon replied honestly. Despite the awkwardness, Rick had been professional and helpful since Michael had intervened. "Excellent. I'll let you finish up then." Michael turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Rick, when you're done here, Jamal needs some help with the Jenkins paperwork. Something about a parts warranty issue." Rick's face paled slightly. "Yes, sir. I'll go find him as soon as we're finished." After Michael left, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. Rick stared at the paperwork, but seemed to be looking through it rather than at it. He shook himself and continued with the forms. "Just a few more," he said, his voice strained. "Then we'll get you scheduled for delivery." As they worked through the last of the paperwork, Brandon's attention was drawn to a photograph on Michael's desk. From this angle, he could see it more clearly than before. Michael with his arm around, Jamal in his graduation gown, both of them beaming with pride. Next to it was another frame that Brandon hadn't noticed earlier. It showed a younger Jamal, maybe in high school, sitting in a hospital bed with his leg in a cast. Michael was beside him, looking worried but supportive. Rick followed Brandon, gazed to the photos. His expression darkened, and he quickly looked away. "Mr. Wilson is very proud of his son," Brandon commented. Rick nodded stiffly. "He has reason to be. Jamal he's overcome a lot." There was something in Rick's voice. Regret? Guilt? Brandon couldn't quite identify it, but it wasn't the resentment or dislike he had expected. "Looks like he was hurt," Brandon said, nodding toward the hospital photo. Rick's pen stopped moving. For a long moment, he was completely still. Then, so quietly Brandon had to strain to hear, he said, "Yes, he was." Before Brandon could ask anything else, Jamal himself appeared at their desk. He was taller than Brandon had realized, well over 6 feet, with the same confident bearing as his father. He was holding some papers and looking directly at Rick. "Dad said you'd help me with the Jenkins warranty," he said, his voice neutral. Rick looked up, meeting Jamal's eyes for the first time that Brandon had seen. Something passed between them. Not exactly hostility, but a complicated mixture of emotions that Brandon couldn't decipher. "I'll be done here in about 10 minutes, Rick replied, his voice steady but tight. Jamal nodded. "I'll be in the service office." He glanced at Brandon. "Congratulations on your new car, Mr. Musellem." "Thank you," Brandon replied. "Your father speaks very highly of you." A small smile touched Jamal's lips. "My dad's my biggest fan. Always has been, even when I made it difficult." His eyes flicked back to Rick momentarily. Then he turned and walked away. Rick stared after him, his expression unreadable. Then, with visible effort, he returned his attention to the paperwork. "Just one last form," he said, sliding a document across the desk. "This confirms the delivery date and time. We can have the atlas ready for you tomorrow afternoon if that works for you." Brandon signed the form. "Perfect. I appreciate all your help today." Rick nodded, gathering the signed papers into a folder. "I'll get these to the finance department and they'll prepare everything for tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "Mr. Musellem, I want to apologize for earlier. When you first came in, I shouldn't have made you wait like that." The latter another apology seemed sincere, if uncomfortable. Brandon studied Rick's face, trying to understand this complex man who had ignored him when he entered but was now helping him so diligently. "Thank you for saying that," Brandon replied. "I appreciate it." Rick nodded, eyes downcast. "You should be all set. If you have any questions before pickup tomorrow, you can call the dealership and ask for me or Mr. Wilson." As Brandon stood to leave, he noticed Rick's gaze drift back to the photos on Michael's desk, lingering on the hospital image. There was a story there, a painful one, Brandon suspected, that connected these three men in ways he was only beginning to glimpse. "I'll see you tomorrow afternoon then," Brandon said, extending his hand. Rick seemed surprised by the gesture but shook Brandon's hand firmly. "Yes, 2 o'clock. We'll have the Atlas ready for you." Brandon headed toward the exit, but realized he needed to use the restroom before the drive home. He asked a receptionist for directions and was pointed toward a hallway near the customer lounge. As he walked back from the restroom, Brandon noticed Rick heading out a side door. A sign next to it read, "Employee Break Area." Brandon checked his watch. It was just past noon. Lunchtime. His own stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast. The customer lounge had a small cafe that sold sandwiches and coffee. Brandon decided to grab something before heading home. Freight. Cafe was busy with customers waiting for their vehicles to be serviced. Brandon ordered a turkey sandwich and coffee, then found an empty table in the corner. As he ate, he texted Tanya with an update. "Deal is done. Picking up the car tomorrow at 2. Wait till I tell you about this place." Tanya replied quickly, "Can't wait to hear. Proud of you for sticking it out after how they treated you." Brandon smiled at his phone. Tanya always had his back. As he finished his sandwich, 2 salespeople entered the cafe and sat at the table next to his. They were too caught up in their conversation to notice him. "Man, Rick doesn't look good today," said the first one, a young man with blonde hair. His nameplate read, Tyler. The second salesperson, an older woman named Diane, according to her nameplate, nodded. Ever since Jamal started working in service last month, Rick's been on edge. Brandon tried not to eavesdrop, but they were sitting so close, and his curiosity was piqued. He pretended to be absorbed in his phone while listening. "I don't get why Wilson hired his son here," Tyler said. "He must know it makes Rick uncomfortable." Diane shrugged. "Michael does what he thinks is right. Always has. And Jamal needed the job after his last one fell through." "Yeah, but still." Tyler lowered his voice slightly. "Given their history and all." Brandon's ears perked up at this. "History? What history?" "What history?" Tyler asked, echoing Brandon's thoughts. "You never told me the whole story." Diane glanced around the cafe, then leaned closer to Tyler. "It happened years ago, before I started here, but everyone knows about it. Rick was—" She stopped abruptly, noticing Brandon sitting nearby. "I'll tell you later," she said, nodding subtly in Brandon's direction. Tyler looked disappointed but nodded. They switched to talking about their sales numbers for the month. Brandon finished his coffee, disappointed that the conversation had been cut short just when it was getting interesting. He threw away his trash and headed back to the showroom to thank Michael before leaving. As he approached Michael's office, he heard voices inside. The door was partially open, and Brandon could see Michael sitting at his desk, with Jamal standing nearby. They seemed to be having an intense discussion. "Dad, I know what I'm doing," Jamal was saying. You don't need to protect me anymore." "It's not about protection," Michael replied. "It's about doing what's right, for everyone involved." "But is it right for him?" Jamal asked. "Sometimes I think you're being too—" He broke off as he noticed Brandon standing near the doorway. "Mr. Masellam," he said, straightening up. Michael turned. "Mr. Masellam, is everything all set with your purchase?" "Yes, thank you," Brandon said, feeling awkward for interrupting. "I just wanted to thank you before I left. I'll be back tomorrow to pick up the car." "Excellent! We appreciate your business." Michael stood and came around the desk to shake Brandon's hand. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call." Jamal nodded to Brandon. "Enjoy your new SUV, Mr. Masellam." "Thank you," Brandon replied. He hesitated, then added, "You have a wonderful father." Something flickered in Jamal's eyes, pride, mixed with something more complex. "I know," he said quietly. "Not everyone gets second chances, or knows what to do with them when they come." Brandon wasn't sure what to make of that cryptic statement, but before he could respond, Rick appeared in the doorway behind him. "Mr. Wilson, I'm heading to lunch now, if that's okay," Rick said, his eyes darting between Michael and Jamal. "Of course, Rick," Michael replied. "Take your full hour. It's been a busy morning." As Brandon left the dealership and walked to his old Honda, his mind was buzzing with questions. What was the history between Rick and Jamal? What second chance was Jamal referring to? And why did Rick react so strongly whenever Michael called him son? The Honda took 4 tries to start this time. As Brandon pulled out of the lot, he glanced back at the dealership. Through the glass showroom windows, he could see Rick returning to his desk. Even from a distance, the man looked troubled. On the drive home, Brandon couldn't stop thinking about the strange dynamics he'd witnessed. As a teacher, he'd developed a keen sense for reading people, especially when something was wrong. And something was definitely wrong at Sunshine Auto Sales. When he pulled into his driveway, Tanya was waiting on the porch. She greeted him with a kiss. "So, where's the new car?" she asked. "Picking it up tomorrow. Had to finalize some paperwork." Brandon followed her inside. "But let me tell you about this place. It was the strangest car-buying experience I've ever had." Over lunch, Brandon told Tanya everything. How Rick had ignored him at first, Michael's intervention, and the strange tension between Rick and Jamal. And every time Michael called Rick's son, he flinched like he'd been slapped, Brandon explained. "There's definitely a history there that I'm missing." Tanya leaned forward, intrigued. "So what do you think happened?" "I don't know, but I overheard something about Jamal being in the hospital years ago. There was a photo on Michael's desk of Jamal with his leg in a cast. Maybe Rick caused the accident?" Tanya suggested. "Like a car accident or something." Brandon considered this. "Maybe. But that doesn't explain why Michael would hire him, or why he keeps calling him son. It's almost like he's doing it on purpose." After lunch, Brandon decided to prepare some materials for Monday's class. Teaching high school math kept him busy, especially with finals coming up. But as he sat at his computer, his thoughts kept drifting back to the dealership. Out of curiosity, he opened a web browser and typed Michael Wilson Sunshine Auto Sales into the search bar. Several results came up: ads for the dealership, some reviews, a few community event notices with Michael's name mentioned. Then, on the second page of results, something caught his eye. A news article from 8 years ago titled "Local Business Owner Gives Second Chance to Man Who Injured Son." Brandon's heart raced as he clicked the link. The article was from the local newspaper's archive, but only a preview was visible without a subscription. He could read just the first paragraph. Michael Wilson, owner of Sunshine Auto Sales, has made the controversial decision to hire Richard "Rick" Daniels, one of 3 men convicted in the 2010 assault of Wilson's son, Jamal. The attack, described by prosecutors as racially motivated, left Jamal Wilson hospitalized with... The rest was behind a paywall. Brandon stared at the screen, stunned. A racially motivated assault? Rick had been convicted of attacking Jamal? And then Michael had hired him? Without hesitation, Brandon subscribed to the newspaper's digital access. He had to know the whole story. As the full article loaded, Brandon read it carefully. According to the report, Jamal had been a college sophomore when he was attacked outside a party by 3 white men. The assault was brutal. Jamal suffered a broken leg, cracked ribs, and a concussion. The attackers had used racial slurs during the assault, leading to hate crime charges. All 3 men were convicted. 2 received longer sentences, but Rick Daniels, described as less involved in the actual violence, served 4 years. After his release, he struggled to find employment due to his criminal record. The article quoted Michael Wilson. "I believe in second chances. I believe people can change. If we don't give them the opportunity to prove they've changed, we're failing as a society." There was a small photo accompanying the article. A younger Rick being led out of a courtroom in handcuffs, his face hard and angry. Nothing like the nervous, submissive man Brandon had met today. Another paragraph described the community's reaction. Many praised Michael's Christian forgiveness, while others criticized him for putting a violent racist on his payroll. The final paragraph mentioned that as a condition of his employment, Rick was required to attend anti-racism education and counseling. Brandon sat back in his chair, trying to process this information. It explained so much: Rick's discomfort around Jamal, his reaction to being called son by Michael, the tension that filled the dealership. "Find anything interesting?" Tanya asked, coming into the room with 2 cups of coffee. Brandon turned, the screen toward her. "You won't believe this." Tanya read the article, her eyes growing wider. "Oh my God," she whispered. "And you bought a car from this man?" "Technically, I bought it from the dealership," Brandon said. "But yes, Rick is my salesperson. How do you feel about that?" Tanya asked, studying his face. It was a good question. How did he feel? Part of him was angry that Rick had ignored him when he first entered the dealership. Was that lingering racism? Or just discomfort? And what about Michael's decision to hire the man who had hurt his son? Was it noble forgiveness or something else? "I'm not sure," Brandon admitted. "It's complicated." Later that evening, as Brandon was grading papers, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sunshine Auto Sales. "Mr. McCellum? This is Rick Daniels from Sunshine Auto Sales," said the familiar voice, sounding strained. "I'm calling to confirm your appointment tomorrow at 2 o'clock. "Yes, I'll be there," Brandon replied, hearing the slight change in his own voice now that he knew Rick's history. There was a pause on the line. "Mr. McCellum, there's something I wanted to say," Rick continued, his voice lower. I want to apologize again for how I treated you when you first came in. It was wrong of me." Brandon was silent for a moment. "Why did you ignore me, Rick?" he asked directly. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't have a good answer." "For that," Rick finally said, "old habits, bad habits, it's no excuse." "No, it's not," Brandon agreed. "I understand if you want another salesperson to handle your delivery tomorrow," Rick said quietly. Brandon thought about it. Part of him did want another salesperson. But another part, The teacher in him, who believed people could learn and change, was curious. "That won't be necessary," Brandon said. "I'll see you tomorrow at 2." As he hung up, Brandon noticed a folded newspaper on his desk, the community section of last Sunday's paper. Something tickled his memory. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, a small article about a community award. The recipient was smiling in a small black and white photo. It was Jamal Wilson, being recognized for his work with at-risk youth. The program he ran was called Second Chance Initiative. Brandon stared at the article, the pieces finally clicking into place. Jamal wasn't just tolerating his father's decision to hire Rick. He was actively working on the principle of second chances himself. The next day, Brandon arrived at Sunshine Auto Sales at exactly 2 o'clock. The showroom seemed less intimidating now that he knew what was going on beneath the surface. Rick was waiting near the entrance, looking nervous, but more composed than the day before. "Good afternoon, Mr. Musellem," he greeted Brandon. "Your Atlas is ready. We just finished detailing it." "Great," Brandon replied, studying Rick's face. In the light of what he now knew, the man looked different to him. Not just a rude salesperson, but someone with a troubled past who was trying to rebuild his life. Rick led him to the finance office where they completed the final paperwork. The finance manager reviewed everything with Brandon, and within half an hour, all the documents were signed. "Congratulations on your new vehicle," the finance manager said, handing Brandon a folder with copies of all the paperwork. "Rick will show you to your car and go over some of the features before you drive off." Outside, the blue Atlas sparkled in the sunshine. It looked even better than Brandon remembered. Rick walked him around the vehicle, pointing out features and explaining how to set up the Bluetooth connection. As they completed the walk-around, Brandon spotted Michael and Jamal talking near the service entrance. Michael noticed them and waved, then said something to Jamal. They both started walking over. "Looks like Mr. Wilson wants to say goodbye," Rick said, his voice tightening slightly. Brandon nodded. He could see the tension return to Rick's shoulders as Michael and Jamal approached. "Mr. Musellem, what do you think of your new Atlas?" Michael asked enthusiastically. "It's perfect," Brandon replied. "Thank you for all your help." "It was our pleasure. Rick take good care of you?" "He did," Brandon confirmed, glancing at Rick, who was staring at the ground. Jamal stepped forward. "Those Atlas models are solid. I've worked on a few in the service department. You shouldn't have any problems with it." "Good to know," Brandon said. An awkward silence fell over the group. Brandon made a decision. "Mr. Wilson, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Michael looked surprised but nodded. "Of course. Rick, why don't you and Jamal finish up the delivery while I talk with Mr. Musellem?" Rick looked alarmed at being left alone with Jamal, but nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." As Michael led Brandon toward his office, Brandon glanced back to see Rick and Jamal standing beside the Atlas, not speaking, but not walking away either. Once they were in Michael's office with the door closed, Brandon got straight to the point. "Mr. Wilson, I hope you don't mind, but I looked up some information about your dealership online last night, and I came across an article about you hiring Rick Daniels." Michael's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "I see. How do you see?" Article mentioned that Rick was convicted of assaulting your son in a racially motivated attack. Michael nodded slowly. "That's correct. It happened 8 years ago." "May I ask why you hired him?" Michael sat back in his chair and looked at a framed photo on his desk, the one of Jamal in his graduation gown. "That's a fair question," he said quietly. "When the attack happened, I was filled with anger, the kind of anger that consumes you. I wanted those men to suffer for what they'd done to my son. I went to every court hearing. I stared them down. I wanted them to feel my hatred. He paused, his eyes distant with the memory. During the sentencing, Rick looked at me and Jamal directly for the first time. He said something that stayed with me. He said, "I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. But I want you to know that seeing your son's blood on my hands changed me forever. I'll carry that shame until I die." Michael shook his head. I didn't believe him then. I thought it was just talk to get a lighter sentence. But 2 years into his prison term, he wrote me a letter, and then another, and another. 15 letters over 2 years. I didn't answer any of them. "What did the letters say?" Brandon asked. They tracked his journey, his genuine remorse, his struggle to understand why he'd done what he did, the counseling he was receiving. In the last letter, he didn't ask for forgiveness or for anything at all. He just thanked me for being a good father to Jamal. He said that his own father had taught him to hate, and he wished he'd had a father like me. Michael's voice grew quiet. That letter arrived the same week Jamal told me he wanted to start a program for troubled youth, kids who were heading down dangerous paths. He said his attack had shown him how hatred is taught, not born. Brandon nodded. The teacher in him knew this was true. So when Rick was released and couldn't find work because of his record, I made a decision. I offered him a job with conditions: ongoing counseling, anti-racism education, community service. Jamal was against it at first, but eventually he understood what I was trying to do. "And calling him son?" Brandon asked. A small, sad smile appeared on Michael's face. Rick told me once that his father called him son whenever he was about to teach him something hateful. "Listen, son, let me tell you about those people." I call him son to replace those memories with something different, to show him that words can heal as well as hurt. Brandon was silent, taking in the complexity of what Michael had done, not just offering employment, but attempting to reshape Rick's entire understanding of the world. "It hasn't been easy," Michael continued. "Rick still struggles. He still has moments of falling back into old patterns, like when you first walked in yesterday. But he's not the same man who attacked my son. That man wouldn't have apologized to you. That man wouldn't care that he'd done wrong. And Jamal? How does he feel now?" Michael sighed. "It's complicated. Some days are better than others. Working together has been challenging for both of them. But Jamal believes in what we're doing. His Second Chance initiative is built on the same principle, that people can change if given the right support and opportunity." Brandon thought about his own students, how some arrived in his classroom angry at the world, how some transformed over the course of a year with the right guidance, and how some remained resistant to change no matter what he tried. "Thanks, you for explaining," Brandon said. "It's given me a lot to think about." "I hope it doesn't change your mind about the car," Michael said with a small smile. "It doesn't," Brandon assured him. "If anything, it makes me prouder to do business with your dealership." They returned outside to find Rick showing Jamal something on the Atlas's dashboard. They weren't exactly comfortable with each other, but they were talking. When they saw Brandon and Michael approaching, they both straightened up. "All set?" Rick asked, handing Brandon the keys. "All set," Brandon confirmed. He hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Rick, for everything." Something flickered in Rick's eyes, surprise, followed by a cautious gratitude. He nodded, unable to find words. "Drive safely, Mr. Musellem," Michael said, extending his hand. "And remember, any questions or concerns, we're just a phone call away." As Brandon slid into the driver's seat of his new Atlas, he felt a mix of emotions. The car purchase had turned into something much more complex than he'd expected. He started the engine, enjoying the smooth, quiet purr. After the rattling of his old Honda, it felt like luxury. He waved to the three men as he pulled away from the dealership. In his rearview mirror, he could see them standing together, Michael in the middle, Rick and Jamal on either side. Not friends, not comfortable, but somehow making it work. On the drive home, Brandon thought about what he'd witnessed over the past 2 days. As a teacher, he'd always believed in second chances. How many times had he worked with troubled students, hoping to set them on a better path? How many times had he seen small victories? A student who stopped getting into fights, who started turning in homework, who finally met his eyes when speaking. But this was different. What Rick had done went beyond typical teenage mistakes. Violent, racially motivated attack that had put Jamal in the hospital. Could someone truly change after that? Michael seemed to think so, and Jamal, the victim himself, was working with at-risk youth, trying to prevent others from making the same choices Rick had made. When Brandon pulled into his driveway, Tanya came out to admire the new car. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed, walking around the Atlas. "Was Rick there when you picked it up?" "Yes," Brandon replied. "And I talked with Michael about the whole situation." Inside, over coffee, Brandon shared everything Michael had told him. Tanya listened attentively, her expression thoughtful. "That's quite a story," she said when he finished. "Do you think Rick has really changed?" Brandon considered the question. "I think he's trying. That's what matters, isn't it? That people keep trying to be better." Later that evening, Brandon was preparing lessons for the coming week when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sunshine Auto Sales again. Assuming it was a routine follow-up call, he answered. "Hello, Mr. Musellem." It was Rick's voice. "I just wanted to make sure everything's going well with the Atlas." "Everything's great, thanks," Brandon replied. "The car drives beautifully." There was a pause. Then Rick spoke again, his voice different. Less professional, more human. "Mr. Musellem, there's something else. I know you talked with Mr. Wilson today. About me. About what I did." Brandon was silent, unsure how to respond. Rick continued, "I want you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I need you to know that I'm truly sorry for how I treated you when you first came in. It was wrong, and there's no excuse." "Thank you for saying that," Brandon said quietly. "When Mr. Wilson hired me 5 years ago, a lot of people were angry. They didn't think I deserved a second chance. Most days, I don't think I deserve it either. But I'm trying to earn it." "That's all any of us can do, isn't it?" Brandon said. "Keep trying to be better than we were yesterday." "Yes, sir." Rick paused again. "One more thing. Jamal's Second Chance program is having a fundraiser next month. It would mean a lot if you could come. As a teacher, your support would be valuable." Brandon was surprised by the invitation. "I'll be there," he promised. After hanging up, Brandon sat thinking about second chances, forgiveness, and the hard work of change. As a math teacher, he dealt in absolutes, numbers that were either right or wrong. But human beings were more complicated. People weren't equations that could be neatly solved. The next morning, Brandon drove his new Atlas to school. As he pulled into the teacher's parking lot, he spotted Andre Jackson, a student who had been struggling all year, skipping class, failing tests, getting into arguments with other students. Brandon had been working with him, trying to get through to him, but progress was slow. Andre was sitting alone on a bench, looking miserable. On impulse, Brandon parked and walked over to him. Morning, Andre. Everything okay? The boy shrugged. Just the same old stuff. Brandon sat down beside him. You know, I had an interesting experience this weekend. I met some people who reminded me that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. Andre looked skeptical. Yeah? Yeah, Brandon said. It got me thinking about second chances and third chances and however many chances it takes. Andre was quiet for a moment. You think I need another chance? I think we all do, Brandon replied. And I think we all deserve them. As they walked together toward the school building, Brandon glanced back at his new car. Through his rearview mirror yesterday, he had seen 3 men, each flawed, each trying in their own way to move forward. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a human one. And that, Brandon thought, was a lesson worth passing on. I hope you enjoyed A Second Chance at Sunshine. This story reminds us that the journey toward change, though difficult, is always possible. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content that explores the complexities of human relationships. Remember, we all have the power to give second chances and to be agents of positive change in our communities. One small act of kindness or understanding can ripple outward in ways we might never fully see. Subscribe now for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of our shared humanity.